Okay, this is part two of the book review about the book Conversations with Goethe by Johann Eckermann. He's a young guy who went to visit Goethe. He's kind of like what James Buswell was to Samuel Johnson as a biographer. That is what Eckermann is to Goethe. The young writer goes to meet with the old, great, famous genius writer and to study his ways and to share that with the public. Okay, I'm going to give you a warning about German philosophers. The big famous German philosophers, they're all either crazy or total assholes. Okay, I've studied them now, and I was kind of shocked. Goethe, you can learn a lot from Goethe. We're going to talk about the good stuff in the third part. I'll make this the second part. Friedrich Hegel, he gets credit for the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And some people say that really belongs to Johann Fichte. Okay, Fichte is a jerk that started the Prussian school after the loss of the German army to Napoleon at Jena. Okay, so they thought we need to be more careful about how we educate these young men. We need to train them to just obey, to conform, to do as they're told, not to think, to simply obey orders. And then America adopted that public school system, which really pushes memorizations and obedience rather than learning and thinking. Okay, then Immanuel Kant comes along, and Immanuel Kant, Ayn Rand described him as the most evil man who ever lived, who denies the intellect. And he did that on purpose to confuse people, to try to say, well, you can never trust your senses, so you can never really know anything for sure. Okay, so Immanuel Kant's a total scumbag. And that's relevant, even though he's a total scumbag, it's relevant because Schopenhauer was quite influenced by him. Now, Schopenhauer, out of all of them, is the one I've got the most useful ideas from, because Schopenhauer did spend a long time, he wrote an entire book about literature, the art of literature. And he really looked deep into what does it take to produce a masterpiece book. And so I love that. And I read a bunch of other stuff by Schopenhauer. Don't get me wrong, Schopenhauer is crazy. Nietzsche says it sounds like he's almost already dead. And Schopenhauer was very pessimistic. So there's a lot of stuff I don't like about him. Okay, Nietzsche is totally overrated. Nietzsche was this like crazy homosexual who hated Christianity because he thought it was anti-homosexual. He loved the Greeks in a sense because he thought it was pro-homosexual, but he hated Socrates because he thought Socrates and Plato had weakened the Greeks with all their intellectual philosophizing. He said it's better to be like Dionysus and just fight. And Nietzsche himself, his big hero was Napoleon, and he's just sort of like this violent. What was good about Nietzsche was he says, be nonconformist. Figure out your own path. That's valuable. And he was kind of funny and clever on some other things. But he's more like superficially entertaining for a young person. There's not that much useful to get out of Nietzsche. Out of all of them, the ones who I felt were most valuable, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that's valuable from the likes of Hegel and Fichte. From Schopenhauer, How to Become a Great Writer. He really was magnificent on that subject. And then Goethe is more like a coach. He's like very positive and encouraging and energetic. So that's all valuable. Anyways, now let's talk some more about Goethe. He was homeschooled until he was 16 years old. And homeschooling is much, much better. You learn so much more from homeschooling than you do in a regular school. And you learn good stuff. You learn stories about people rather than memorizing dates that you forget after the test. Goethe was a polymath. He was mostly a poet. If I look at him and I say everything, I've now studied him quite a bit, I mostly think of him as a poet. And to me, that's bad because poetry is pretty much specific for the language it was made in, German for Goethe, and it just doesn't translate well to other languages. So most of his poetry cleverness, it's of no value to somebody who doesn't speak German. He was also a novelist, but he's overrated as a novelist. Sours and Young Werther was good for a young guy to read it, but there's not much in there for an old guy who already knows. You got to be careful with women. They'll break your heart if you're a chump. He was interested in botany, mineralogy. He was a theater director in Weimar for many years. He was a statesman working for the Duke. He was seen also in cultural circles as a bridge between the neoclassical age, the so-called 1700s, Enlightenment so-called, and the Romanticism of the 1800s. Okay, but he's much more neoclassical than romantic, I would say. He himself had said, classicism is healthy, romanticism is sickness. Big scholar, over 5,000 books in his library. His typical day would be, carry out his Weimar duties, whatever that might be. read, write a poem, go to the theater at night, or be the director of the theater at night, of course. He'd entertain guests at his home when there was no theater, and they would play piano and sing or talk, and a lot of visiting celebrities would come and want to talk to him. Goethe is seen to Germany as Shakespeare was to England, but the big difference between the two is nobody knows much about Shakespeare's personal life. And the reason they don't know much about Shakespeare's personal life is because Shakespeare was a Catholic. And this was after the time where the Puritans and the Protestants were in total control, and Shakespeare was afraid they were going to kill him. So he kept his personal life very private. On the other hand, Goethe, we know a ton about his personal life from his own writings, and of course, most famously from Conversations with Eckermann Book. Okay, Goethe is both Apollonian, which is sort of a Christian sense, but he's also a lot Dionysian, if you will, which is sort of a bit of a degenerate in a lot of ways. He lived through the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and Napoleon. The French Revolution and Napoleon can be said as sort of like a turning point where people just were sick of the BS, the cold cruelty of the atheistic Enlightenment age, and longed for sort of the more warm, emotional turning back to Christianity of Romanticism. Okay, so basically the way you can think of it is neoclassical 1700s, Romantic age 1800s, and that works pretty well because the French Rev was like 1789 to 1794. Okay, but he had all this stuff that was happening right around him, as well as Napoleon's loss to Wellington. Wellington was the leader of the army from England. Okay, so all that was contemporary with him. He had noticed that the Romans had great people that inspired him, like I just talked about, like Horatio at the gate, Mucius Scaviola fighting off the Etruscans and going before Lars Porsena, the king of the Etruscans, Lucretia, who had been taken advantage of by a man, and she made that her death confession, and that sort of inspired the Romans. So anyways, he greatly admires the great people and the great stories of the people, and he hates the historians that come along hundreds of years later and say, oh, none of it's true. He's like, F you guys, leave the people alone to their culture, their history, and their stories, okay? And I agree with Goethe 100% on that. And that's been happening in all countries. A new power comes in, and they try to rewrite the history to demoralize the people and make them weak and easier to control. Just like in the USA, the left comes in and they try to rewrite all the history book that America has the greatest founding fathers ever in the history of the world. Anybody who studied it knows that, of any country. And they try to rewrite them as, a bunch of racists. Okay, kiss my ass. Why does everybody want to come to the USA? Because it was a magnificent country. It's gone down a lot in the last 50 years, but it's still the greatest country in the world, but it's really gone down from the past. Okay, let us continue. Goethe, he says, most men don't care about science. They only want to make money from it. I think that's a true statement. He saw the Germans as kind of being Philistines, certainly Philistines in comparison with the ancient Greeks. Okay, and he's also pissed because a lot of people would give him a hard time about all his different creative work, and he's like, they can't touch my talent, so they criticize my character. Okay, let's see. Will Durant, the historian, said that in mainland Europe, France was sort of like Athens, very educated place in those days around the turn of the century, and Germany in comparison was like Sparta. Very militaristic and martial and primitive in his ways. And like I said, from these German philosophers, you can learn something from them and learn what you can, but don't take them as role models because they're all crazy. Okay, Goethe loved long walks, being in nature. His Faust book, his last book, that was his magnum opus. Okay, Carl Jung had said that part 1 of Faust, where he's just with Gretchen, was written by his conscious mind, and that part 2 was written by his unconscious mind. That goes into a lot more things, subconscious mind. Goethe, the person born with the talent will have their greatest happiness in using it. Yeah, I think that's true. Like a horse is happy when it runs. Goethe, one ought every day to hear a little song, read a good poem, see a fine picture, and if it were possible, speak a few reasonable words. Yeah, just to maintain your artistic talent. Okay. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about problems with Goethe. I'm going to make that a separate lecture, so I'm going to make 4 parts then. This will be part 3. I just did part 2. Okay, I hope you found this helpful.